The morning sun painted the walls of Targovishta Palace in golden light as Lady Elisaveta adjusted her silk gown and prepared for what she believed would be another peaceful day at court. She was 24 years old, the wife of a boyar who had served 3 princes before this one, and mother to twin daughters who played in the palace gardens while she attended to her duties. In less than 6 hours, her husband would be dead, her children would be orphans, and she would begin a journey into darkness that would redefine everything she understood about survival, power, and human cruelty. This was April 1457, and the ruler watching from his throne was not the romantic vampire of legend, not the cape-wearing seducer of Gothic novels, but something far more terrifying. A man who had discovered that the fastest way to break a kingdom was to break its women, and who had spent years perfecting techniques of psychological and physical destruction that would make hardened soldiers weep and cause the most powerful empire on earth to retreat in horror. His name was Vlad Dracula, and what he did to the women of his realm was not a side effect of medieval brutality. It was the strategy, it was the weapon, it was the message he carved into flesh and bone and sent across continents to warn anyone who might challenge him. Hollywood gave you fangs and eternal romance. History gives you something infinitely darker. If you think you know the story of Dracula, everything you believe is a lie designed to protect you from the truth. The real monster never needed to bite necks or transform into bats, because what he did to living women was far more terrifying than any supernatural power could ever be. This is the story they tried to erase, the truth they buried beneath centuries of fictional blood and Gothic romance. Before we dive into the depths of this nightmare, I need you to understand that what you're about to learn will change how you see power, cruelty, and the price that innocent people pay when monsters rule. Hit that subscribe button now, because this channel uncovers the historical truths that textbooks refuse to teach and popular culture deliberately obscures. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you're prepared to learn what really happened behind the castle walls. The transformation of Vlad from troubled prince to systematic destroyer of women began decades before Lady Elisaveta would meet her fate. In 1442, when Vlad was barely 11 years old, his father made a decision that would reshape the future of an entire kingdom. To secure peace with the Ottoman Empire, he sent his 2 youngest sons as hostages to the court of Sultan Murad II. What happened during those 6 years in Ottoman captivity created the monster that would terrorize Europe. But this was not ordinary captivity. The Ottomans had perfected a system of psychological conditioning that turned enemy princes into either loyal servants or broken victims. Young hostages were subjected to daily humiliations designed to strip away their identity, their dignity, and their connection to their homeland. They watched public executions carried out with methodical precision. They observed the systematic breaking of captured women from conquered territories. They learned that power was not inherited or earned, but seized through the calculated application of terror. Vlad absorbed these lessons with the intensity of a scholar studying sacred texts. He watched Ottoman officials demonstrate how fear could be more effective than armies, how the destruction of families could shatter entire communities, and how targeting women specifically could break the will of even the strongest warriors. He observed the precise techniques used to maximize suffering while prolonging life, the psychological methods employed to destroy hope, and the theatrical elements that transformed individual cruelty into mass intimidation. When news arrived in 1447 that his father had been assassinated by the very boyars who had sworn loyalty to him, something fundamental shifted in the young prince's mind. His older brother had been captured, tortured for days, and buried alive by nobles who smiled at court functions while plotting murder in palace corridors. The boy who had entered Ottoman captivity, still believing in honor and loyalty, emerged as something entirely different. He had learned that trust was weakness, that mercy was suicide, and that the only way to prevent betrayal was to make the consequences so horrific that even contemplating disloyalty would drive potential enemies to madness. Most importantly, he had discovered that women were not just victims of war, but weapons of psychological destruction that could be wielded with surgical precision against anyone who dared oppose him. The first test of these newly acquired principles came when Vlad briefly claimed the throne in 1448, only to be driven out within months by the same boyar families who had murdered his father. During his exile, he spent years planning not just his return to power, but the systematic elimination of everyone who had betrayed his family. This was not going to be conventional warfare or political maneuvering. This was going to be a demonstration of what happened when you cross the son of Dracula. When opportunity finally presented itself in 1456, Vlad moved with the patience of a master strategist and the ruthlessness of someone who had nothing left to lose. He understood that simply killing his enemies would not be sufficient. Their deaths needed to serve as permanent warnings that would echo through generations. Their suffering needed to be so complete, so public, and so deeply embedded in collective memory that future potential traitors would choose loyalty out of sheer terror rather than risk facing similar fates. The plan he devised was brilliant in its simplicity and horrifying in its execution. Rather than striking immediately upon his return to power, he would wait for the perfect moment when his enemies felt secure, when they had gathered together in celebration, when their wives and daughters were present to witness what was about to unfold. The stage would be set during Easter Sunday, 1457, when the boyar families would gather at Terrorizing Palace for the traditional holiday feast. Lady Elisaveta had attended dozens of these gatherings over the years. They followed predictable patterns of political discussion disguised as social conversation, elaborate displays of wealth and status, and careful negotiations between families seeking to advance their interests through strategic alliances. She expected this Easter celebration to be no different from any other court function she had experienced. The hall was magnificent that morning, filled with the most powerful families in Wallachia. Boyars wore their finest robes, their wives displayed jewelry that represented generations of accumulated wealth, and their children ran between tables while servants prepared elaborate courses that would demonstrate the prosperity and stability of the realm. The atmosphere was festive, almost carnival-like, as nobles who had spent months in their distant estates reconnected with court society. Vlad himself appeared relaxed, almost jovial, as he moved through the crowd greeting guests and inquiring about their families. He complimented wives on their gowns, asked fathers about their sons' education, and seemed genuinely interested in the mundane details of noble life. Several boyars later commented to their wives that the new prince appeared far more reasonable and approachable than the dark reputation that had preceded his return to power. The transformation began during the formal portion of the feast when Vlad rose from his throne and requested the attention of his assembled guests. The hall quieted as nobles turned toward their prince, wine cups still in hand, expecting perhaps a ceremonial toast or announcement of some new policy that would benefit their families. Instead, Vlad asked a single question that would change everything. How many princes had they known during their lifetimes? The inquiry seemed innocent enough, almost philosophical, the sort of question that might lead to interesting dinner conversation about the nature of leadership or the challenges facing small kingdoms caught between great empires. The oldest boyars began counting on their fingers, some smiling as they recalled princes from their youth, others nodding thoughtfully as they considered the implications of the question. The youngest nobles had witnessed the reigns of 7 or 8 rulers. Those who had served their families for decades could remember 20 or even 30 different princes who had sat on the throne of Wallachia. Each had promised stability, prosperity, and protection for the noble families who supported them. Each had eventually been betrayed, murdered, or driven into exile by the very people who had initially welcomed them to power. Vlad listened to their answers with the patient attention of someone conducting important research. He nodded encouragingly as they shared stories of past rulers, asked follow-up questions about specific princes, and seemed genuinely fascinated by the details of how previous reigns had ended. The atmosphere remained comfortable, almost academic, as nobles discussed the political history they had personally witnessed. Then the doors slammed shut. The sound echoed through the stone hall like thunder, cutting through conversations and causing every head to turn toward the massive oak barriers that now sealed the only exits from the room. Armed guards emerged from alcoves where they had been waiting in silence, surrounding the gathered nobles with weapons drawn and expressions that revealed nothing but cold professionalism. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Festive celebration became trapped panic as nobles realized they had walked willingly into a carefully constructed trap. Wives grabbed their husbands' arms, children began crying, and the most experienced boyars immediately understood that they were about to pay the price for decades of political betrayal and murdered princes. Vlad's voice cut through the rising panic with deadly calm. The reason for his question had become clear, he explained to his trapped guests. The problem with Wallachia was not foreign invasion or economic hardship, but the fundamental instability created by noble families who treated princes as disposable puppets to be manipulated and discarded whenever convenient. Every prince they had mentioned had been destroyed by the very people now sitting at these tables. Every reign had ended in betrayal, orchestrated by families who smiled and offered loyalty while secretly planning assassination. The constant cycle of violence and treachery had turned Wallachia into a graveyard for rulers and a playground for ambitious boyars who believed themselves above consequence. That cycle was about to end permanently. But Vlad's justice would not be swift or simple. It would be educational, demonstrative, and designed to ensure that the lessons learned in this hall would be remembered for generations. The older boyars would die immediately for their crimes against previous princes, but their wives, their daughters, and their younger family members would serve a different purpose in the new order he was about to establish. The guards moved with practiced efficiency, separating the nobles into different groups based on age and gender. The elderly boyars were dragged toward the palace courtyard, where wooden stakes had been prepared in neat rows like a grotesque garden. Their screams began almost immediately, piercing cries that carried through the stone walls and reached every corner of the hall where their families remained trapped. Lady Elisaveta watched in horror as her father-in-law was hauled away by 2 soldiers, his dignity stripped along with his ceremonial robes. The man who had taught her husband about statecraft and honor was reduced to pleading and terror within moments. She pressed her hands against her ears, but nothing could block the sounds that followed, the systematic destruction of men who had ruled this kingdom for generations. But the true horror was only beginning. Vlad had studied the psychology of power during his years in Ottoman captivity, and he understood that killing the boyars was merely the opening act. The real message would be written on the bodies of their wives and daughters, carved into flesh that had never known hardship, demonstrated through suffering that would echo across generations of noble families. The younger boyars and their male heirs faced a different fate than their elders. Rather than immediate execution, they were stripped of their fine clothes and chained together in preparation for a journey that would transform them from pampered aristocrats into broken laborers. Their wives and daughters would accompany them, but not as prisoners to be ransomed or political hostages to be negotiated. They would become the living instruments of Vlad's justice. 50 miles north of the capital, the ruins of Poenari Castle perched on a cliff overlooking the Argesh River. The fortress had been abandoned for decades, its walls crumbling and its towers collapsing from neglect and weather. It was strategically positioned to control the mountain passes between Wallachia and Transylvania, but rebuilding it would require enormous effort and resources that the kingdom could barely afford. Vlad had found the perfect solution to both problems. The noble families who had destroyed so many princes would rebuild this fortress with their own hands, their own blood, their own slowly breaking bodies. The wives and daughters who had lived lives of luxury while their husbands plotted treason would learn what real labor meant. They would discover what it felt like to have their soft hands torn by stone, their delicate skin burned by sun, their pampered bodies pushed beyond every limit of endurance. The march began at dawn the following day. 200 noble women, still wearing the silk gowns they had donned for Easter celebration, were chained together in a line that stretched nearly half a mile. Their jewelry had been stripped away, their comfortable shoes removed, their carefully arranged hair already becoming disheveled from a single night spent on stone floors without proper bedding. Lady Elisaveta felt the iron shackles close around her wrists with enough pressure to cut into skin. The metal was cold and heavy, already chafing against bones that had never supported such weight. Beside her, a countess who had never walked more than a few hundred yards in her entire life, stared at the mountain path ahead with dawning comprehension of what awaited them. The journey itself became the first stage of their destruction. Women who had traveled their entire lives in comfortable carriages with cushioned seats and protective canopies now stumbled barefoot across rocky terrain. Their silk slippers had been designed for palace floors, not mountain paths, and within hours the delicate fabric was shredded beyond recognition. Some collapsed before they had traveled 5 miles from the capital. The guards showed no mercy, dragging unconscious bodies until the effort became too burdensome, then simply abandoning them beside the trail for wolves and ravens to claim. The message was clear from the beginning: survival would depend entirely on individual strength and endurance. Those who could not match the pace would be left behind to die alone in the wilderness. Food became a luxury measured in scraps. Water was rationed according to the whims of guards who seemed to take pleasure in watching noble women beg for basic necessities. The countess beside Elisaveta, a woman who had commanded dozens of servants just days earlier, was reduced to fighting over muddy puddles with peasant women who had been captured during the journey. The weather turned against them as they climbed higher into the mountains. Spring rains soaked through their ruined gowns, and mountain winds cut through fabric that provided no protection against the elements. At night, they huddled together on bare ground, their bodies the only source of warmth in a landscape that seemed designed to kill them slowly through exposure and exhaustion. By the second week, the transformation was complete. The elegant ladies who had graced Easter Court now resembled walking corpses, their faces gaunt from hunger, their hands bloody from constant contact with rough stone and metal chains. Their beautiful gowns had rotted into rags that barely covered their bodies, leaving them exposed to sun and cold alike. When they finally reached the ruins of Poenari Castle, Vlad was waiting. He had ridden ahead to oversee the preparations for their arrival, ensuring that everything was ready for the work that would consume whatever remained of their lives. The sight that greeted them was both their destination and their doom. A crumbling fortress perched impossibly high on a cliff face, accessible only by a narrow path that wound upward through loose rock and treacherous terrain. The stones they would carry had been quarried from the mountain itself, each one weighing more than most of these women had ever lifted in their previous lives. The blocks were irregular in shape and size, with sharp edges that would cut into flesh and rough surfaces that would tear through whatever remained of their clothing. Moving them up the cliff face would require strength that noble women had never been required to develop. Vlad explained their situation with the same calm patience he had shown during the Easter feast. They would rebuild this fortress stone by stone, using only their hands and backs to transport materials up the mountainside. No tools would be provided except for the most basic implements. No shelter would be offered except what they could construct from the stones themselves. No medical care would be given to those who suffered injuries during the work. The timeline was indefinite. They would continue until the fortress was complete or until they died from exhaustion, whichever came first. Those who attempted to escape would be caught within hours, and impaled in sight of the others as a reminder that death was not an escape Vlad would grant easily. Their only choice was between slow death through labor or immediate death through punishment. Lady Elisaveta looked at the massive stones scattered around the base of the mountain and felt her mind struggle to comprehend the impossibility of what lay ahead. Each block would need to be carried hundreds of feet up a nearly vertical cliff face by women whose bodies had been weakened by weeks of starvation and exposure. The physics alone seemed impossible, but the alternative was immediate execution. The work began that same afternoon. The first stone Elisaveta attempted to lift was roughly the size of her torso and weighed more than her 7-year-old daughter. Her soft hands, which had never grasped anything heavier than embroidery needles or wine goblets, immediately began bleeding as the rough surface tore through her palms. The weight was crushing, pressing down on shoulders and back muscles that had never been tested by serious physical labor. The path up the mountainside was a nightmare carved from living rock. Each step required navigating loose stones that shifted underfoot, threatening to send both woman and burden tumbling hundreds of feet into the abyss below. Lady Elisaveta's legs trembled with exhaustion after just the first trip, her muscles screaming protests that her pampered body had never experienced. The descent was almost worse than the climb, as gravity pulled at her weakened frame, and the knowledge that another stone awaited at the bottom filled her with despair that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Within 3 days, her hands had transformed into raw meat, barely recognizable as human appendages. The fingernails she had carefully maintained for court appearances were torn away completely, leaving bloody nail beds exposed to mountain air and stone dust. Her palms had developed deep gashes that refused to heal, constantly reopened by each new stone she was forced to carry. The pain was so intense that she could no longer feel individual cuts, just a constant burning agony that radiated up her arms with every movement. The woman working beside her, a duchess who had once commanded a household of 50 servants, collapsed on the 4th day. She had been struggling with a particularly large stone when her legs simply gave out, sending both woman and burden crashing against the cliff face. The impact opened a gash across her forehead that immediately began bleeding down her face, but the guards showed no concern for her injury. They simply kicked her until she stood up and pointed toward another stone. By the end of the first week, their silk gowns had disintegrated completely. The fine fabric that had once displayed their wealth and status now hung in rotting strips that provided no protection against the elements. Some women attempted to preserve modesty by wrapping the remaining tatters around their bodies, but the constant work made such efforts futile. Soon, they were laboring essentially naked, their pale skin burning under mountain sun and freezing during mountain nights. The psychological destruction was as systematic as the physical torment. Women who had spent their entire lives being served by others now fought desperately over scraps of food thrown at them like dogs. The Countess of Ramnicu, who had never eaten a meal without silver utensils, was reduced to licking grease from her fingers after being given a bone with traces of meat still clinging to it. The transformation from nobility to animal desperation happened so quickly that some women seemed to lose their minds entirely. Sleep became another form of torture. At night, they collapsed onto bare stone without blankets or shelter, their exhausted bodies pressed against cold rock while mountain winds cut through their exposed skin. Some women never woke up, their hearts simply stopping during the freezing nights. Their bodies were dragged away at dawn and thrown over the cliff, disappearing into the darkness below while the survivors were forced to continue working as if nothing had happened. The accidents began during the second week when exhaustion made coordination impossible. A baron's wife lost her footing while carrying a massive stone and tumbled 40 feet down the cliff face. Her screams echoed off the mountains for several minutes before stopping abruptly. Another woman, the mother of 3 children who would never see her again, was crushed when a stone she was lifting slipped from her bleeding hands and pinned her against the cliff. She died slowly over several hours while the other women worked around her broken body. Vlad observed their suffering from a platform constructed specifically for his viewing pleasure. He would arrive each morning to inspect the progress and evaluate the condition of his workers. Sometimes he would call out suggestions for improving their efficiency or adjusting their technique. Other times he would simply watch in silence, studying their faces as they struggled with loads that threatened to destroy them completely. The countess, who had walked beside Elisaveta during the march, finally broke on the 12th day. She had been growing weaker each day, her movements becoming slower and more unsteady as her body consumed itself for energy. When she attempted to lift a stone that morning, she simply sat down beside it and refused to move. The guards beat her repeatedly, but she had passed beyond the point where physical pain could motivate action. She died that afternoon, still sitting beside the stone she could no longer lift. By the 3rd week, only half the original women remained alive. The survivors had developed a hollow-eyed appearance that made them barely recognizable as the elegant ladies who had attended Easter Court just months earlier. Their bodies had been carved down to essential muscle and bone, every trace of softness stripped away by starvation and impossible labor. They moved like mechanical devices, lifting and carrying stones with robotic efficiency, while their minds retreated to places where pain could not follow. Elisaveta discovered that survival required abandoning everything that had once defined her identity. Compassion became a luxury she could not afford when helping others meant using energy she needed for her own survival. Modesty disappeared when nakedness became irrelevant compared to the agony of torn flesh and broken bones. Dignity vanished when begging for scraps became necessary for staying alive another day. The fortress slowly took shape through their collective suffering. Walls rose stone by bloody stone, each block representing hours of agony for the women who had carried it up the mountain. The structure they were building would outlast them all, a permanent monument to their destruction that would stand for centuries as proof of what happened to those who crossed Vlad Dracula. Some women attempted escape during the 4th week, when desperation finally overcame fear of punishment. 3 countesses tried to flee during a mountain storm, hoping the weather would provide cover for their attempt. They were captured within hours, their trail easy to follow through the snow. Vlad had them brought back to the construction site, where they were impaled in full view of the surviving workers, their bodies raised on stakes as permanent reminders that death was not an escape he would grant easily. The psychological impact of watching their former companions die slowly on stakes was devastating for the remaining women. They understood that their own deaths would be equally public and equally prolonged if they attempted to flee. The message was clear and unmistakable. Their only choice was between slow death through labor or immediate death through punishment. As winter approached, the surviving women had become something that barely resembled their former selves. They were walking skeletons, wrapped in skin that had been burned, frozen and torn until it resembled leather more than human flesh. Their hair had fallen out in patches from malnutrition and stress. Their eyes had sunk deep into skulls that showed every bone and hollow. The fortress was nearly complete, its walls rising high above the valley floor, like a stone finger pointed accusingly at heaven. Each stone in those walls had been carried by women whose names would never be recorded in any chronicle, whose suffering would never be acknowledged in any official history. They had built their own monument, a castle that would serve as permanent testimony to the price of crossing Vlad Dracula. When the construction finally ended, fewer than 20 women remained alive from the original 200 who had begun the march from Târgoviște. These survivors were kept as servants in the very fortress they had built with their bleeding hands, their noble titles erased and their families destroyed. They would spend whatever remained of their lives climbing the same stairs they had constructed, cleaning the same rooms their labor had created, serving meals in halls built from their own suffering. But the castle at Poenari was just the beginning of Vlad's campaign to reshape society through the systematic destruction of women. While noble wives died on mountain cliffs, He was simultaneously implementing policies that would terrorize every woman in his kingdom, from peasant farmers to merchant wives. The message was spreading throughout Wallachia that female bodies belonged not to the women themselves, but to the prince who ruled them, and any failure to meet his standards would result in punishments that defied imagination. The terror was spreading beyond noble families to encompass every woman in the kingdom, creating a society where half the population lived in constant fear of being noticed by their ruler. And this was exactly what Vlad had intended from the beginning. A systematic campaign of psychological warfare that used female suffering as the primary weapon against anyone who might consider challenging his authority. The transformation of Wallachia into a kingdom ruled by terror had only just begun. While the noble women died building their stone prison in the mountains, Vlad was simultaneously crafting a new social order, where every woman in his realm would understand that her body, her behavior, and her very existence were subject to his absolute judgment. The construction of Poenari Castle had served as a spectacular demonstration for the aristocracy, but the systematic terrorizing of common women would prove far more effective at maintaining total control over his subjects. The first test of his expanded campaign came when a peasant farmer named Stefan was stopped on the road outside Targoviste. The man wore a linen shirt that ended just above his knees, leaving his legs partially exposed in a way that caught the attention of Vlad's guards. In most kingdoms, such a detail would pass unnoticed. But in Vlad's Wallachia, everything was scrutinized for signs of disorder, inadequacy, or failure to meet the prince's standards of proper behavior. When brought before Vlad for inspection, Stefan trembled as he explained that his wife had sewn the garment to the best of her ability. The fabric had been expensive, harder to obtain since trade routes had become dangerous, and she had calculated the measurements carefully to provide adequate coverage while conserving precious material. The shirt represented weeks of careful work by a woman who had learned needlework from her mother and grandmother, skills passed down through generations of peasant families who took pride in their ability to create clothing that would last through seasons of hard labor. Vlad examined the garment with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. He walked slowly around the trembling farmer, noting every stitch and seam, measuring with his eyes the precise distance between fabric edge and knee. The courtyard fell silent as nobles and servants alike recognized that they were witnessing another demonstration of the prince's absolute authority over the most intimate details of daily life. The judgment came swift and final. Stefan's wife had failed in her fundamental duty as a woman to properly clothe her husband. The inadequate length of his shirt was evidence of her incompetence, her laziness, or perhaps her deliberate disrespect for social order. Such failure could not be tolerated in a kingdom where every citizen was expected to maintain standards that reflected well upon their ruler's domain. Marta was summoned from her cottage, where she had been tending to their infant son and preparing the evening meal. She arrived dusty from working in their small garden, her hands stained with soil and her simple dress marked by the honest labor that sustained their family. When she saw her husband surrounded by armed guards and standing before the prince himself, her face went pale with the recognition that their ordinary life had suddenly become entangled in forces far beyond their control. Vlad questioned her about the shirt, with the same methodical approach he had used when interrogating boyars about their political loyalties. Why had she made it so short? Did she lack sufficient fabric? Were her hands somehow damaged and unable to work properly? Had she deliberately chosen to embarrass her husband by sending him into public wearing inadequate clothing? Marta's explanations fell on ears that had already determined her guilt. She described the careful measurements she had taken, the way she had calculated fabric usage to ensure nothing would be wasted, the hours she had spent ensuring every stitch was strong enough to withstand Stefan's work in the fields. Her voice grew more desperate as she realized that her honest answers were being interpreted as evidence of her inadequacy rather than proof of her diligent efforts. The sentence was announced before the assembled crowd with the same ceremonial gravity that had marked the destruction of the Boyar families. Marta would pay the ultimate price for her failure to properly serve her husband and, by extension, her failure to maintain the social order that Vlad demanded from every citizen in his realm. Her death would serve as education for every wife and mother in the kingdom about the consequences of falling short of royal expectations. What followed was designed to maximize both suffering and instructional value for the witnesses forced to observe. The execution was not swift or merciful, but prolonged and theatrical, calculated to engrave itself permanently into the memory of everyone present. Marta's screams echoed through the courtyard for what seemed like hours, while her husband was forced to watch every moment, his own survival dependent upon showing no emotion that might be interpreted as criticism of the prince's justice. The method chosen was flaying, the systematic removal of skin while keeping the victim conscious and aware throughout the process. Skilled executioners had developed techniques that could prolong the procedure for extraordinary periods, ensuring that the educational value was maximized while the victim remained alive to experience every stage of their destruction. Marta's agony became a public lesson about the price of female inadequacy in Vlad's kingdom. When her ordeal finally ended, her body was displayed on a stake in the village square, where it would remain for days as a permanent reminder of what happened to women who failed to meet royal standards. The sight of her mutilated corpse became a daily confrontation with mortality for every woman who passed through the square, a constant reinforcement of the message that their survival depended entirely upon perfect execution of their domestic duties. Stefan was immediately provided with a replacement wife selected from among the local women. Vlad personally chose a young widow whose husband had died in the spring, a woman named Anna who had demonstrated exceptional skill in textile work and household management. The prince explained to Anna in front of the assembled villagers that she now had the opportunity to succeed where Marta had failed, but that failure on her part would result in consequences even more severe than what they had just witnessed. Anna understood that she was not receiving a husband, but accepting a death sentence with temporarily delayed execution. Her survival would depend upon her ability to exceed every expectation, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, and to maintain standards of domestic perfection that had never before been demanded of peasant women. The pressure was crushing, but refusal meant immediate death, while compliance offered at least the possibility of survival. The story of Marta's execution spread through Wallachia with the speed of wildfire, carried by traders, traveling craftsmen, and relatives visiting distant villages. Within weeks, every woman in the kingdom had heard detailed accounts of what happened to wives who failed to properly clothe their husbands. The psychological impact was immediate and profound, creating a climate of terror that penetrated into every household and transformed the most basic domestic activities into potential death sentences. Women began inspecting their husbands' clothing with obsessive attention to detail, checking and rechecking measurements, examining every seam for signs of weakness that might bring royal attention to their households. Mothers taught daughters that survival meant perfection in traditionally feminine skills, that any visible flaw in cooking, cleaning, or needlework could result in spectacular punishment that would destroy entire families. The terror was not limited to clothing. Vlad's agents reported back to him about any household where standards appeared to be slipping, where wives seemed insufficiently attentive to their duties, or where women displayed behavior that might be interpreted as disrespectful to male authority. The network of surveillance created an atmosphere where neighbors watched neighbors for signs of female inadequacy that might reflect poorly on the entire community. A merchant's wife in Brasov was reported for serving bread that was slightly burned during a meal attended by traveling officials. The woman, Elena, had been managing a household of 8 people, while her husband conducted business in distant markets. Working from dawn until midnight, to maintain their property and care for their children. The burned bread was the result of being called away to tend to a sick infant, but such explanations were considered irrelevant when weighed against the evidence of domestic failure. Elena's punishment was designed to address multiple lessons simultaneously. She was stripped naked in the town square and forced to bake bread while being pelted with stones by the assembled crowd. Each loaf that emerged imperfect from the public oven resulted in additional blows until she produced bread that met standards established by observers who had been selected for their harshest judgment. The process continued for hours while her children were forced to watch their mother's humiliation and understand the price of female inadequacy. When Elena finally collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss, she was revived and forced to continue until sunset. Her survival was presented as mercy, but the psychological damage was permanent. She would spend the remainder of her life in constant terror of making any mistake that might bring renewed attention from authorities who had demonstrated their willingness to destroy her publicly for the smallest domestic failure. The systematic targeting of women for spectacular punishment created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Husbands became paranoid about their wives' performance, knowing that female inadequacy reflected directly upon male authority and could result in punishment for entire families. Children grew up understanding that their mothers existed in constant danger, that the women who cared for them could be destroyed at any moment for infractions that seemed trivial but carried lethal consequences. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. Women stopped leaving their homes unless absolutely necessary, afraid that any public appearance might result in scrutiny that could prove fatal. They abandoned social gatherings, where their behavior might be observed and judged. They ceased participating in market activities, where their domestic skills might be compared to those of other women, and found wanting. Marriages became arrangements of mutual terror, where wives lived in constant fear of failing to meet impossible standards, while husbands understood that their family's survival depended upon their wives' perfection. The traditional support networks that had sustained women through difficulties were dismantled, as everyone became afraid of association with anyone who might attract negative attention from royal authorities. The isolation was particularly devastating for new mothers who had traditionally relied upon the wisdom and assistance of other women during childbirth and infant care. Now they faced these challenges alone, terrified of asking for help that might be interpreted as evidence of their inadequacy. Many women died in childbirth who might have survived with proper assistance, but seeking such help had become too dangerous to risk. Widows faced especially precarious situations since their unmarried status made them automatically suspect in a society that demanded every woman be attached to male authority. Those who remarried too quickly were accused of insufficient mourning for their deceased husbands. Those who remained single too long were suspected of immoral behavior or unwillingness to fulfill their proper role as wives and mothers. A widow named Ileana in Pitești made the fatal error of remarrying only 4 months after her husband's death from fever. She had 3 young children who needed care and no other means of support, making remarriage an economic necessity rather than a romantic choice. Her new husband was a kind man who had offered to provide for her family during their time of greatest vulnerability. The speed of her remarriage was reported to royal authorities as evidence of inappropriate behavior that violated proper mourning customs and suggested she had been unfaithful to her deceased husband. The accusation was impossible to disprove since it relied upon interpretation of her emotional state rather than evidence of actual wrongdoing. But in Vlad's kingdom, suspicion was equivalent to guilt when it came to female behavior. Ileana's punishment was designed to address the perceived insult to her deceased husband's memory, while simultaneously warning other widows about the dangers of remarriage timing. She was taken to the cemetery where her first husband was buried and forced to dig up his decomposing corpse with her bare hands. The process took hours while a crowd gathered to witness her humiliation and absorb the lesson about proper widowhood behavior. When the corpse was finally exhumed, Ileana was forced to embrace the rotting remains, while confessing her inadequate devotion to his memory. The psychological trauma of holding her decomposing husband while admitting to failures she had never committed broke her mind completely. She was then buried alive beside the grave she had dug, her screams muffled by earth while her children watched from the crowd that had gathered to witness their mother's destruction. The message to other widows was unmistakable. Their grief was subject to royal evaluation and judgment. Their timing in seeking new husbands would be scrutinized for evidence of insufficient devotion to deceased spouses. Their economic desperation was irrelevant when weighed against social expectations that demanded prolonged mourning, regardless of practical necessities. Young unmarried women faced different, but equally lethal pressures. They were expected to maintain perfect virtue while simultaneously preparing for marriage, to be attractive enough to secure husbands, while avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as immodest. The standards were contradictory and impossible to navigate safely, creating a situation where any choice could result in fatal consequences. A baker's daughter named Sophia was accused of immodest behavior because she had smiled at a young man while walking to market with her mother. The interaction lasted only seconds and consisted entirely of polite acknowledgement between neighbors who had known each other since childhood. However, witnesses reported the smile as evidence of inappropriate flirtation that violated standards of proper feminine behavior. Sophia's trial became a public spectacle where her entire life was examined for evidence of moral corruption. Neighbors were encouraged to report any instance of behavior that might support accusations of immodesty. The fact that no additional evidence could be produced was interpreted as proof of her skill in concealing her true nature, rather than evidence of her innocence. The punishment selected for Sophia was designed to permanently mark her as an example of female moral failure, while simultaneously destroying any possibility of the marriage that had been her expected future. Her face was branded with symbols that identified her as a woman of questionable virtue, ensuring that no respectable family would consider her as a potential daughter-in-law. The physical pain of the branding was excruciating, but the social death was permanent. Sophia would spend the remainder of her life as a marked woman, excluded from normal society, and forced to survive through whatever means were available to those who had been publicly designated as moral failures. Her destruction served as education for other young women about the impossible standards they were expected to navigate successfully. The systematic terrorizing of women created a society where half the population lived in constant fear, while the other half was trained to monitor and report on female behavior. Men understood that their own survival often depended upon their willingness to denounce the women in their lives for infractions that might otherwise go unnoticed. The traditional bonds of family loyalty were severed when maintaining them became potentially fatal. Fathers reported daughters for behavior that seemed insufficiently modest. Husbands denounced wives for domestic failures that they had previously overlooked. Brothers informed authorities about sisters who displayed independence that violated social expectations. The fabric of society was rewoven around mutual surveillance and the constant threat of betrayal. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate fear to fundamental changes in how women understood their place in the world. They internalized the message that their bodies belonged not to themselves, but to male authority figures who could dispose of them at will. They learned that survival required perfect submission and constant vigilance against any behavior that might be interpreted as defiance or inadequacy. Children growing up in this environment learned that women were inherently dangerous and unreliable, capable of bringing destruction upon entire families through their failures and inadequacies. Young boys absorbed lessons about male superiority and female expendability that would shape their treatment of women throughout their lives. Young girls understood that their future survival would depend entirely upon their ability to satisfy impossible standards while avoiding any behavior that might attract negative attention. The terror was self-perpetuating, creating a society where women policed themselves and each other with ruthless efficiency. The threat of spectacular punishment was so effective that actual executions became less necessary over time as the female population had been thoroughly conditioned to anticipate and prevent any behavior that might provoke royal displeasure. But Vlad's campaign against women was not limited to his own subjects. As his reputation for creative cruelty spread beyond Wallachhia's borders, he began implementing tactics designed to terrorize entire populations through the systematic destruction of women captured during military campaigns. The techniques he had perfected on noble wives and peasant mothers would soon be exported to neighboring territories as weapons of psychological warfare more devastating than any conventional military strategy. The transformation of female suffering into international diplomacy was about to begin, and the methods Vlad had developed through years of domestic terrorism would prove so effective at breaking enemy morale that even the most powerful empires would retreat rather than risk exposing their own women to similar fates. The true scope of his systematic destruction was only beginning to reveal itself. The winter of 1462 brought a different kind of horror to the villages along the Danube River. Vlad's domestic campaigns had successfully terrorized his own people into submission, but neighboring territories still posed threats to his absolute authority. The Ottoman Empire maintained garrisons across the border. Bulgarian settlements provided refuge for potential enemies, and Hungarian nobles continued plotting against his reign. Traditional warfare would require armies he did not possess and resources his kingdom could not spare. Instead, Vlad chose to export the psychological weapons he had perfected on Wallachian women. The first cross-border expedition began with surgical precision. Rather than attempting to conquer territory or capture strategic positions, Vlad's forces moved through enemy villages like a plague designed to destroy specific targets. Men who offered resistance were killed immediately, their deaths serving merely as preliminaries to the real purpose of these raids. The true objectives were the women and children who would become messages written in flesh and blood. In a Bulgarian farming community called Razgrad, the initial attack lasted only minutes. The few men capable of fighting were cut down before they could organize effective resistance. Their bodies left where they fell, while Vlad's soldiers gathered the surviving population in the village square. What happened next followed protocols that had been refined through months of domestic experimentation with noble wives and peasant mothers. The selection process was methodical and terrifying. Families were separated based on age and perceived value, with special attention paid to mothers with young children. These combinations had proven most effective at maximizing psychological impact during previous operations. The bonds between mothers and daughters created opportunities for layered suffering that could be calibrated to produce specific emotional responses in witnesses. A woman named Svetlana held her 12-year-old daughter, Mila, as soldiers approached with wooden stakes that had been specially prepared for the demonstration. The stakes were rounded rather than sharp, designed to prolong suffering rather than cause immediate death. Each one had been greased with animal fat to ensure slow penetration that would allow victims to remain conscious throughout their ordeal. Today, tourists climb the stone steps of Poenari Castle, taking selfies where Lady Elisaveta once carried rocks with bleeding hands. They buy Dracula merchandise in gift shops built on mass graves. Hollywood gave you a romantic vampire who seduced women in moonlit castles. History gave you a monster who destroyed them in public squares, who turned female suffering into statecraft, who proved that absolute power creates absolute horror. The women of Wallachia deserved better than to become footnotes in a legend about fangs and eternal life. They deserved to be remembered for what they truly were: victims of systematic cruelty designed to terrorize an entire civilization into submission through the calculated destruction of its most vulnerable members.